went to the wrap party, that this was it for the Andy Griffith Show.
Mayberry never existed. Not really. It was a soundstage in Southern California dressed up to look like small-town North Carolina, populated by actors who spent years pretending to love each other in front of the cameras. And for the most part, they did love each other. The Andy Griffith Show is remembered today as one of the warmest, most wholesome pieces of television ever produced, a show where nobody raised their voice and every problem got solved by supper time. But warmth on screen doesn't always mean warmth off it. Behind one of the most beloved family dynamics in TV history sat a real and lasting rift, one that involved the show's biggest star and the actress who played America's favorite aunt. It was a tension that outlasted the series itself, that followed both performers for decades, and that only fully came to light after one of them was already gone. This is the story of that rift, and of the boy caught in the middle of it. A kid named Ron Howard who grew up to become one of the most respected directors in Hollywood. The Andy Griffith Show premiered on CBS on October 3rd, 1960, and ran until April 1st, 1968. Over 8 seasons, it produced 249 half-hour episodes, 159 filmed in black and white and 90 in color. It began life as a backdoor pilot on The Danny Thomas Show, introducing Andy Griffith as Sheriff Andy Taylor, a widowed lawman raising his young son Opie in the fictional town of Mayberry, North Carolina. Though the town was invented, Griffith always described the feel of the show as belonging to an earlier era, something that felt more like the 1930s and the 1960s, when it was actually being filmed. The cast quickly became iconic. Don Knotts played the excitable, accident-prone Deputy Barney Fife. Frances Bavier played Aunt Bee, Andy's steady, nurturing aunt who ran the Taylor household. And a young Ron Howard, credited at the time as Ronnie Howard, played Opie, the sheriff's son. Together, they formed the image of small-town American family life that made the show a phenomenon. Commercially, the numbers were extraordinary. The show never finished lower than 7th in the Nielsen ratings during its entire run, and it closed out its 8th and final season ranked number 1, a feat shared with only 2 other sitcoms in television history, I Love Lucy and Seinfeld. Strangely, Andy Griffith himself never won an Emmy for the role that made him famous, though his co-stars did well. Don Knotts and Frances Bavier combined for 6 acting Emmys between them over the years. The show's afterlife has been long. It spun off Gomer Pyle, USMC, inspired a 1986 reunion film, and continued in spirit with Mayberry RFD fans still gather every year for a Mayberry-themed festival in Mount Airy, North Carolina, Griffith's hometown, which is widely considered the real-life inspiration for the fictional town. None of that success, though, tells the whole story of what it was like to actually work on that soundstage. Ronald William Howard was born on March 1st, 1954, in Duncan, Oklahoma, into a family that was already living and breathing show business. His father, Rance Howard, was an actor, writer, and director who had adopted his stage surname after being born under a different last name. At the time of Ron's birth, Rance was serving a 3-year stint in the U.S. Air Force. Ron's mother, Jean Spiegel Howard, was an actress in her own right. Ron was partly educated on studio lots, tutored between takes as a working child actor, and partly educated in ordinary Burbank schools, including John Burroughs High School. He later enrolled at USC School of Cinematic Arts, but didn't finish his degree. By that point, directing had already pulled him in a different direction. He started working extraordinarily young. By age 5, he already had a film credit in a movie called The Journey, and he began popping up in television, including appearances on The Twilight Zone and other shows of the era. But the role that changed his life came in 1960, when he was cast as Opie Taylor on The Andy Griffith Show. He played that role for all 8 seasons. Howard has generally spoken warmly about Andy Griffith's influence on him during those years, describing Griffith as a steadying, generous presence on set for a child actor. That relationship is well documented and largely positive. The far more complicated relationship on that soundstage wasn't between Howard and Griffith. It was between Griffith and the woman who played his on-screen aunt. To understand why Frances Bavier behaved the way she did on that soundstage, it helps to understand who she was before she ever set foot in Mayberry. She was born Frances Elizabeth Bavier in New York City in December 1902, and she'd originally set out to become a teacher, enrolling at Columbia University with that plan in mind. Acting found her almost by accident through vaudeville and an early lucky break as an understudy, and once it did, she never went back to teaching. She built a genuinely substantial stage career, spending roughly 25 years on Broadway before she ever appeared in a film or television show. Her credits included the original Broadway production of On Borrowed Time and the play Point of No Return, in which she appeared alongside Henry Fonda. During World War II, she spent 2 years touring with the USO, entertaining American troops overseas in the Pacific Theater, work that earned her enough goodwill among veterans that a former Marine later collected 10,000 signatures from fellow servicemen just to thank her for it. She didn't move to Hollywood until 1951, already in her late 40s, with a serious New York theater pedigree already behind her. Her first notable film role was in the science fiction classic The Day the Earth Stood Still, and she went on to appear in more than a dozen films and a wide range of television guest spots, on shows like The Lone Ranger, Perry Mason, and Dragnet, before landing recurring roles on It's a Great Life and The Eve Arden Show. By the time she was cast as Aunt Bee in 1960, she was already a veteran performer with decades of serious professional experience, not a newcomer looking to prove herself. That background matters because it explains a lot about the friction that followed. Bavier came from a tradition of serious, disciplined stage work, where professionalism meant precision and reserve. The Andy Griffith Show, by contrast, ran on looseness, camaraderie, and constant joking around between takes. Producer Sheldon Leonard later described her plainly in an interview included in the Andy Griffith Show book, calling her a rather remote, highly professional performer with a distinct individual character, someone self-contained who simply wasn't part of the general horseplay that centered on Griffith. Another producer on the show, Richard Link, put it even more bluntly, saying she was touchy and moody due to her age and had to be handled carefully, adding that Griffith had likely offended her more than once, even as the two of them eventually grew closer. According to author Richard Kelly, who interviewed multiple cast and crew members for his 1981 book on the show, Bavier's clashes with the cast were tied directly to those unusually high standards of professionalism, standards that simply didn't mesh with a set built around constant lightheartedness. Bavier herself, in an interview years later, described the difficulty of playing a role so identified with her that audiences no longer saw her as a separate person at all, only as the character. That tension between the private, guarded actress and the beloved public image of Aunt Bee never fully resolved, on set or off it. The clearest, most direct account of just how bad things got comes from Rance Howard, Ron Howard's father, who was also on set regularly during the show's run. Rance said plainly that Griffith seemed to carry some genuine resentment toward Bavier, and speculated that she had likely been the choice of producer Sheldon Leonard rather than Griffith's own preference for the role. Rance also described a specific moment that captured how far things had deteriorated. Walking back from a table read toward the soundstage one day, he recalled Jim Nabors, who played Gomer Pyle, quietly telling Griffith to ease up, reminding him that Bavier was a good actress and deserved to be treated well. According to Rance, Griffith had no response to that at all. He just kept walking. It wasn't only Griffith who found her difficult. Howard Morris, who played the memorable recurring character Ernest T. Bass and also directed several episodes of the show, once compared working with Bavier to walking through a minefield. Something as small as asking her to shift a few inches for a camera angle could set off real resistance. She was fiercely particular about her space, her positioning, and how she was presented on screen, and she didn't take well to being second-guessed on any of it. Ron Howard himself, reflecting on the dynamic later in life, offered a more measured version of events, saying essentially that Bavier never seemed to feel like she was part of whatever mischief the rest of the cast got up to together. That's a far cry from claiming outright hatred. What the record actually supports is something more specific. A serious, sustained personality and professional clash between two performers with fundamentally different temperaments, not a documented statement that young Ron Howard personally despised Frances Bavier. It's important to be precise about that distinction, because a lot of retellings over the years have blurred it. One of the most telling moments in the entire saga happened well after the show had ended. Sometime in the 1970s or 1980s, accounts differ slightly on the exact year. Andy Griffith and Ron Howard decided to pay Frances Bavier a visit. By then, she had retired from acting and was living a quiet, private life in Siler City, North Carolina, a town that closely resembled the fictional Mayberry she had once played a version of on screen. They showed up unannounced. Bavier did not let them in. According to reporting from a North Carolina publication, Triad City Beat, she spoke to them only through her closed front door. It wasn't a warm reunion. If anything, the visit seemed to confirm just how firmly she had drawn a line between her past on that show and the life she'd built afterward. Reports at the time also noted that she had repeatedly declined to take part in the Mayberry reunion movie project, which only reinforced the sense that whatever had happened between her and Griffith, it hadn't healed with time. Andy Griffith himself, discussing the relationship publicly much later on the TV Academy's Pioneers of Television series and in various interviews over the years, never threw Bavier under the bus. That was consistent with his general public posture, professional and restrained, even as the rumors about their feud circulated through Hollywood for decades. One detail that's easy to overlook is that Bavier's relationship to the show didn't end when Andy Griffith's did. Griffith departed the series in 1968 to focus on his film career, but Bavier stayed on, continuing in the role of Aunt Bee for 2 additional seasons when the show was retooled and renamed Mayberry RFD. She was, in fact, the only original cast member to remain with the series through that transition, which suggests that whatever difficulties she had on set, her commitment to the role itself and to the show's success was never really in question. Her body of work earned real recognition along the way. In 1967, she won the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Performance by an Actress in a Supporting Role in a Comedy for her portrayal of Aunt Bee, a genuine peak in a career that had already spanned decades by that point. She finally retired from acting in 1972 and bought a home in Siler City, North Carolina, a real town that bore an uncanny resemblance to the fictional Mayberry she'd spent a decade playing a version of. There, by most accounts, she lived quietly and somewhat reclusively, sharing her home with more than a dozen cats and rarely leaving the house in her later years. A communications official from the University of North Carolina's Public Television Center, who had some contact with her during that period, later described her life as sparse and very quiet. It was a stark contrast to the bustling, sociable household she was known for on screen. The story might have simply ended there, an unresolved Cold War between 2 television legends, if not for what happened near the end of Bavier's life. She was diagnosed with cancer, and in her final months, she picked up the phone and called Andy Griffith directly. Griffith later recounted that conversation in interviews, including one with broadcaster Ralph Emery. According to Griffith, Bavier told him she was sorry they hadn't gotten along better and admitted it had been her fault. She told him he had run the show and made it a success, and said she simply wished things had gone differently between them. It was, by all accounts, a sincere and direct apology, offered without excuses, from a woman known for guarding her privacy fiercely for most of her life. Griffith didn't make this story public right away. He didn't confirm the long-rumored feud at all until a 1998 interview on Larry King Live, years after Bavier had already passed away. That restraint says something about how seriously he took the idea of speaking for someone who could no longer speak for herself, or perhaps about simply not wanting to relive it. Frances Bavier died in 1989 at the age of 86. Though she'd been born and raised in New York City, she spent her final years in North Carolina, the same region her character had called home on screen. She'd retired from acting back in 1972 and settled into a quieter life in Siler City, where locals who knew her described someone private but genuinely kind, a very different picture than the difficult reputation that followed her out of Hollywood. Toward the end, she dealt with serious heart-related health problems and was hospitalized at Chatham Hospital, having been released from its coronary care unit just about a week before she died. Her official cause of death was never publicly disclosed in detail, though her heart condition is widely understood to have been the underlying cause. Andy Griffith also lived to 86. He passed away at his home on Roanoke Island, North Carolina, a place he'd come to treat as a genuine sanctuary later in life. His family confirmed he was buried there. The specific cause of his death wasn't made public. Two performers, one enduring television legacy, and a friendship that took decades and a terminal diagnosis to even partially mend. It's worth pausing here to be honest about something. A lot of retellings of this story over the years have taken the real, well-documented tension between Griffith and Bavier and dressed it up with details that don't hold up under scrutiny. Claims about exactly what a young Ron Howard was privately thinking on set, or attempts to draw a straight line from a childhood television feud to completely unrelated modern political disagreements decades later. Those connections make for dramatic narration, but their speculation dressed up as fact, and they tend to erase the more interesting, more human reality underneath. Two serious professionals with incompatible temperaments, working side by side for 8 years, never quite finding peace with each other until it was almost too late. The real story doesn't need embellishment. A woman who valued her privacy above almost everything else, working alongside a man who thrived on being loose and social. Both of them bound together by a show that demanded they perform warmth they didn't always feel for each other. That's compelling enough on its own. Whatever tension existed on that set, it didn't define Ron Howard's career, and it certainly didn't slow him down. When the Andy Griffith Show ended in 1968, Howard was still a teenager, and Hollywood already saw him as far more than a former child star. In 1974, he found a second major wave of fame playing Richie Cunningham on Happy Days, a role that grew out of a segment on Love, American Style, before spinning off into its own long-running series. As the clean-cut, wholesome Richie, Howard played the perfect counterbalance to Henry Winkler's leather-jacketed Fonzie, and the on-screen chemistry between the two of them became a genuine piece of American pop culture. Even while Happy Days was still filming, Howard was already looking past acting entirely. His directorial debut came with the 1977 film Grand Theft Auto, a low-budget action comedy he co-wrote with his father, Rance. The project came out of a deal with producer Roger Corman. Howard would star in another film, Eat My Dust, in exchange for the chance to direct one of his own. It worked. Through the late 1970s and early 1980s, he directed a string of television movies for NBC, before landing his real breakout as a director in 1982 with Night Shift, a comedy starring Henry Winkler, Michael Keaton, and Shelley Long. From there, his career as a filmmaker only accelerated. In 1984, he directed Splash, a romantic fantasy comedy starring Tom Hanks and Daryl Hannah, which was both a commercial hit and a critical success, proof that Howard could deliver movies with genuine mass appeal. The role that finally cemented him as a serious, awards-caliber director came almost 2 decades later. In 2001, Howard directed A Beautiful Mind, the story of mathematician John Nash and his struggle with mental illness, starring Russell Crowe, Jennifer Connelly, Ed Harris, and Christopher Plummer. The film swept the major categories at the Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Supporting Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay, and Howard himself won Best Director. It wasn't without controversy. Critics pointed out that the film left out significant parts of Nash's real life, including a child he'd had outside his marriage, and accused Howard of softening the truth to make for a cleaner, more emotionally satisfying story. Howard later acknowledged that certain details have been left out deliberately in order to keep the film focused on what he considered its emotional core. What reportedly troubled him more than the criticism itself was any suggestion that the backlash was affecting Nash personally. That, by his account, was where he felt the conversation had gone too far. It's a pattern worth noticing across Howard's career. A filmmaker who has generally avoided public drama, who prefers to let his work speak for him, and who seems most uncomfortable not when he's criticized directly, but when he feels a real person at the center of one of his stories is being hurt by the fallout. Amid all of that professional history, one part of Ron Howard's life has remained remarkably steady: his marriage. He met Cheryl Alley when they were both 16 years old, 2 teenagers in California. Their first date was about as simple as it gets. Howard picked her up in a modest Volkswagen Beetle, took her to a movie, and they grabbed pizza afterward. It took him 3 proposals before she said yes. By her own account, Cheryl wasn't ready right away. She had her own goals, her own education and future to work out before she was willing to commit hers to his. They eventually married in Burbank, California, in June 1975, with friends, family, and several of Howard's Happy Days castmates in attendance, including the late Tom Bosley. They went on to raise 4 children together, including daughters Bryce Dallas Howard and Paige Howard, both of whom went on to work and film themselves. On June 7, 2025, Ron and Cheryl marked 50 years of marriage. Howard shared a quiet photo of the two of them on a beach at sunset to mark the occasion, describing their life together as something closer to a long river journey, with calm stretches and difficult rapids, and crediting their endurance to nothing more dramatic than simply continuing to paddle together year after year. For their 2023 anniversary, Howard reportedly surprised Cheryl with a drive in essentially the same style of vintage green Volkswagen from their very first date decades earlier, a quiet, unglamorous callback to where the whole thing started. It's a marriage that has largely stayed out of tabloid coverage, not because nothing ever happened, but because both of them seem to have deliberately kept their private life private in an industry that rarely rewards that kind of restraint. In recent years, Howard has occasionally found himself the subject of public conversation for reasons that have nothing to do with acting or directing craft. One notable example involves his 2020 Netflix adaptation of Hillbilly Elegy, based on the memoir by J.D. Vance. At the time Howard adapted the book, Vance was a private citizen and author, not yet a sitting political figure, and Howard has said the project was approached as a character study rather than anything tied to policy or partisanship. Vance's subsequent rise in national politics is well documented on its own terms, and any specific personal opinions Howard holds about that trajectory are, at most, something he has addressed obliquely and sparingly in public. It would be inaccurate to claim detailed knowledge of Howard's private feelings here, and it would be even less accurate to try to connect those feelings to a decades-old, unrelated dispute with a co-star from his childhood. Those are 2 entirely separate chapters of Howard's life, and treating them as causally linked is exactly the kind of dramatic but unsupported leap that muddies an otherwise well-documented story. What actually happened on the set of The Andy Griffith Show is, in the end, a very human story. 2 accomplished performers, temperamentally mismatched, spent years working side by side to build one of the most enduring images of American small-town life ever put on television, all while privately unable to find much common ground with each other. One of them carried that tension quietly for decades. The other held on to her privacy right up until the very end, when illness finally pushed her to say the thing she'd apparently wanted to say for years. Ron Howard, the boy at the center of that household on screen, grew up largely removed from the worst of that particular conflict, went on to build one of the most respected directing careers in Hollywood history, and build a marriage that has now outlasted the show that made him famous by several decades. Mayberry wasn't real, but the people who built it were, with all the complicated, unresolved, ultimately human relationships that come with any long, close collaboration. That, in the end, is a more interesting story than any invented feud could be.